Tell me the truth, even if it ruins me, she whispered into the rain. But 12 hours earlier, Emily Carter hadn't planned on standing outside a 40-story glass tower with a sick child in her arms and nowhere left to go. The sound came first, a sharp, relentless drizzle tapping against the cracked windshield of her aging sedan, the kind that smelled faintly of stale coffee and long nights, her fingers trembling slightly on the steering wheel as she checked the time. 11:42 p.m., too late for help, too early for hope, and in the back seat, her 6-year-old son Liam stirred under a thin blanket, his small breaths uneven, a soft cough breaking through the quiet like a warning she couldn't ignore. Emily exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried exhaustion more than air, then reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out the envelope she had opened at least 100 times that day, its edges soft from years of being handled. Inside it, a photograph, faded, creased, of a woman, with the same eyes as hers standing beside a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out, and in the corner, barely visible, a logo printed in silver ink, the same logo now glowing across the top of the building in front of her, Hayes Global. She swallowed hard, remembering the eviction notice taped to her apartment door that morning, the polite but final tone of the landlord's voice. The silence that followed when she realized she had no one left to call, no family, no backup, just a child who depended on her to keep moving even when every door had quietly closed. The heater in the car clicked off, leaving behind a cold that settled into her bones. She glanced at Liam again, brushing damp hair from his forehead, too warm, still too warm, and something inside her shifted. Not panic, not quite fear, but a decision that didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the envelope, stepped out into the rain, and shut the car door with more resolve than force. The city lights blurred around her as she crossed the empty street, each step echoing louder than it should have, like the world was paying attention for the first time. By the time she reached the front entrance, her coat was soaked through, her shoes heavy, but she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, because somewhere between losing everything and having nothing left to lose, she had found a reason to walk straight into a place she never belonged. Inside, the lobby was silent, polished marble reflecting cold white light, and behind the front desk, a security guard looked up with mild surprise, already preparing to say no, but Emily didn't look at him. Her eyes fixed instead on the elevator doors as they slid open across the room, revealing a man stepping out in a tailored black coat, his presence quiet but undeniable, the kind that made space without asking for it, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise in her head went completely still, because something about him felt familiar in a way that made no sense at all, and before anyone could stop her, before doubt could catch up, Emily took a step forward into the light, clutching the envelope like it might finally answer the question she had been living her entire life without knowing, and the rainwater dripping from her sleeve hit the marble floor with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed to echo farther than it should have. The guard stepped forward first, his voice controlled but firm, asking if she had an appointment, if she needed assistance, if she realized the time, but Emily barely heard him because the man who had just stepped out of the elevator had stopped walking, and in a place where everything moved with quiet efficiency, his stillness felt louder than any interruption. Alexander Hayes did not raise his voice, did not gesture. He simply looked at her, and for a brief second, something unreadable crossed his face, not irritation, not curiosity, something deeper, like recognition without memory. Emily swallowed as the weight of that gaze settled over her, her coat dripping onto the marble floor, her hair clinging to her cheeks, and suddenly she became aware of how out of place she was, how small she looked in a building designed to make people feel powerful. The guard repeated his question, sharper this time. But before Emily could answer, Alexander spoke, his voice calm, low, the kind that did not need volume to command attention, asking the guard to let her speak, and just like that, the tension shifted, the room seemed to lean toward her, waiting. Emily tightened her grip on the envelope, feeling the edges press into her palm as if reminding her why she was there. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the words caught somewhere between fear and urgency. Because how did you explain a lifetime of questions in a single sentence? How did you ask a stranger for a truth you were not even sure he knew? Alexander took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to see her more clearly. His eyes flicked briefly to the envelope in her hand, then back to her face. And there it was again, that flicker, like something almost remembered. Emily felt her heart pound harder, not from fear, but from the strange sense that she had already crossed a line she could not step back from. She forced herself to speak. Her voice quieter than she intended but steady enough to carry, saying she was not there for money, not there for a job, that she only needed a few minutes. The guard shifted impatiently, but Alexander raised a hand slightly, silencing him without looking away, asking her what she wanted, direct, simple, no wasted words. Emily hesitated, just long enough for doubt to whisper that she should leave, that this was a mistake, that people like him did not hold answers for people like her. But then she thought of Liam, of his fever, of the way his small hand had searched for hers even in sleep, and something inside her steadied. She lifted the envelope slowly, her fingers shaking despite herself, and said she believed this belonged to him, or to his past, or to something he had chosen to forget. The words sounded strange even to her own ears, but they were honest, and honesty was all she had left to offer. Alexander's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes dropped to the envelope, and for the first time, the controlled calm around him cracked just enough to reveal something sharper beneath, something that looked a lot like unease. He asked where she got it, and his tone was still even, but there was a new weight to it, like the answer mattered more than either of them had expected. Emily hesitated again, then told him it had belonged to her mother, that it was the only thing she left behind, and that she had spent years trying to understand why it mattered, why it felt like a piece of a story that had never been told. The lobby fell quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if even the building itself was listening. Alexander reached out, not to take the envelope yet, but close enough that Emily could see the subtle tension in his hand, the way his fingers hovered just short of touching it, like he already knew what was inside and was not sure he wanted to confirm it. And in that suspended moment, before anything was revealed, before any truth could be spoken, Emily realized something she had not expected. She was no longer just searching for answers, she was standing in front of them, and they were looking back at her. Alexander finally took the envelope, but not quickly, not with certainty, his fingers closing around it with a hesitation that did not match the decisive man the world knew. And as soon as it left Emily's hand, she felt the shift, like something invisible had just been set in motion. He turned it over once, studying the worn edges, the faint crease across the center. Details that meant nothing to anyone else but seemed to matter to him in a way he could not hide. The lobby lights reflected faintly across the surface as he slid a finger beneath the flap, pausing just before opening it, as if giving himself one last moment to remain untouched by whatever was inside. Emily watched closely, her breath shallow, her entire body tuned to the smallest movement, because this was it, the point where questions stopped being questions and started becoming answers, and answers, she knew, had a way of changing everything. The guard stepped back without being told, sensing something he did not understand but knew not to interrupt, and for a brief second, the world outside the glass walls seemed to disappear. No traffic, no rain, no distant city noise. Just the quiet between two people standing on opposite sides of the same unknown. Alexander opened the envelope slowly, the soft tear of paper sounding louder than it should have, and inside, the photograph slid into his hand. He looked down, and the change was immediate, subtle but undeniable. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened just slightly, and whatever control he had been holding on to began to slip at the edges, because he recognized it, not just the image, but the moment it represented. The part of his life he had buried so deeply he had convinced himself it no longer existed. Emily watched his reaction more than the photo itself, searching his face for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would tell her she had not come here for nothing. Seconds passed, but they stretched longer than they should have, and when he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes, something heavier, like the weight of memory pressing forward all at once. He asked her name. And this time, it was not a polite question, it was precise, necessary. As if the answer would complete a calculation he had already begun. Emily Carter, she said, her voice steadier now, because whatever fear she had brought with her was slowly being replaced by something else, something closer to truth. Alexander repeated it quietly, not for her, but for himself. like testing whether it fit into a space he had long left empty. Then his gaze dropped again, not to the photograph, but to a detail Emily had not even realized mattered, the small silver chain around her neck. Barely visible beneath her damp collar, and at the end of it, a pendant, simple, worn, but unmistakable. His breath slowed, his focus narrowing, because he had seen that pendant before, years ago, in a different life, on a woman who had once stood in front of him with the same quiet determination, the same refusal to walk away without being heard. Emily noticed the shift in his attention, the way his eyes lingered on the necklace, and instinctively, she touched it, her fingers wrapping around it protectively. As if sensing its importance without fully understanding it, Alexander looked back at her, and for the first time since they had met, the distance between them felt smaller, not physically, but something else, something invisible beginning to connect the past to the present. He asked her where her mother was now, and the question landed softer than she expected, not as an interrogation, but as something closer to regret. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, then answered simply, that she had passed away 3 years ago, that she never spoke much about her past, that she only left behind questions and this one photograph, and a life that never quite made sense. The words hung in the air between them, quiet but heavy, and Alexander closed his eyes for just a moment, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for something inside him to shift, because the story he had tried to forget was no longer distant, it was standing in front of him, breathing, waiting, and for the first time in years, he realized that whatever truth she was searching for, it was not something he could walk away from anymore. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like a room adjusting to a truth no one had planned to face, and Alexander opened his eyes slowly, the photograph still in his hand. But now it no longer looked like an object, it looked like evidence, something that demanded an answer he had avoided for years. He exhaled quietly, then looked past Emily for the first time, toward the glass doors where the rain traced slow lines against the city lights, as if buying himself a second to decide what kind of man he was going to be in this moment, because there were only 2 choices left, deny or face it, and denial had already cost more than he had admitted. Emily shifted her weight slightly, the cold from her soaked clothes settling deeper, but she did not move, did not rush him, because something in his hesitation told her this was not simple, this was not a coincidence. This was a door that once opened could not be closed again. Alexander finally spoke, but not to answer her question, not yet. Instead he asked where she had been living, the question catching her off guard, practical, almost detached, but there was something beneath it, something that felt like he was trying to understand the shape of her life before he stepped into it. Emily hesitated, then answered honestly, that she had been staying in a small apartment about 20 minutes from downtown, that she had been working 2 jobs, that it had not been enough, not lately. Her voice did not break, but it carried the weight of nights without sleep and mornings without options. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable again, but his grip on the photograph tightened just slightly, enough to reveal that the distance he had built was beginning to crack. He asked about her son next. The question softer this time, and Emily blinked in surprise. Before answering, saying his name was Liam, that he was 6, that he had been sick for the past 2 days, and as if on cue, her phone vibrated faintly in her pocket, the small sound cutting through the quiet like a reminder of everything waiting outside this moment. She did not check it, but Alexander noticed, his eyes flicking briefly toward her coat, then back to her face, and something in his posture shifted again, less guarded now, more present, like he was no longer deciding whether this mattered, but accepting that it did. He looked down at the photograph one more time, then at the pendant in her hand, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weaker, just more honest. He said her mother's name, not as a question, but as a fact, and the sound of it seemed to stop the air around them. Emily's breath caught, her fingers tightening instinctively around the chain, because she had not said it, had not given him that peace, and yet he knew in a way that left no room for doubt. She nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face now with something stronger than hope, something closer to certainty, and Alexander closed the distance between them by a single step, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to remove the space where denial could exist. He said that there were things she needed to understand, that the past was not as simple as it looked in a photograph. That choices had been made that could not be undone, and for a moment, it sounded like he was preparing to defend himself, but then he stopped, because even he could hear how empty that would be. Emily shook her head slightly, not rejecting him, but refusing the idea of explanations that softened the truth. And that was when she said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, the same words that had brought her there, asking him to tell her the truth, no matter what it was, and this time, there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty left, because she already knew that whatever he said next was not going to give her a new life, it was going to explain the one she had already lived. Alexander held her gaze. And for the first time since he had stepped out of that elevator, he did not look like a man in control. He looked like someone standing at the edge of something he could not walk away from, and when he finally spoke, the words did not come as an answer, they came as a realization, quiet, heavy, and impossible to take back, because the truth she had been searching for was not hidden somewhere in the past, it was standing right in front of her, shaping every step she had ever taken, whether she knew it or not. Alexander did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than any explanation ever could, because it was not empty, it was full of years, of choices, of moments he had sealed away and labeled as necessary, as unavoidable, as the cost of becoming who he was. But standing in front of Emily, those justifications felt thinner, like something that had survived only because no one had come back to question them. He looked at her, really looked this time, not as a stranger in his lobby, not as an interruption, but as someone whose life had been shaped by decisions he had once made without fully understanding their reach. His voice when it came was steady, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. He said that her mother had come to him years ago, not asking for money, not asking for anything that could be easily dismissed, but asking for time, for acknowledgement, for something that required him to stop and feel instead of calculate, and at the time, he had been building something he believed mattered more, something that demanded every ounce of focus, every sacrifice, and he had convinced himself that stepping away, even for a moment, would cost him everything he had worked for. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, but her stillness was not passive, it was controlled, like she was holding herself together piece by piece. Alexander continued, saying that he had not turned her mother away with cruelty, not with anger, but with something far worse, indifference. He had offered solutions that solved problems on paper, resources, contacts, ways to make things easier without ever truly being present. And when her mother refused those solutions, when she asked for something real instead, he had walked away, believing that time would smooth over what he had left unresolved, that people moved on, that lives adjusted, that not every story needed him in it. The words settled heavily between them, and for the first time, Emily's eyes shifted, not away, but deeper, like she was searching for something beneath what he was saying, something that had been missing from her own life without a name. Her phone vibrated again, longer this time, and she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, before reaching into her pocket and silencing it without looking, because whatever was happening here mattered in a way she could not explain. Alexander noticed, and his gaze lingered on her hand for a moment before returning to her face, and there was a change there, something quieter, more certain. He said that he did not know about her, not then, that if he had known there was a child, things might have been different. But even as he said it, the words felt incomplete, because both of them understood that knowing did not always mean acting, and acting did not always mean staying. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm, asking him if he had ever tried to find out, not about her specifically, but about what happened after he walked away, if he had ever wondered how that story ended. The question was simple, but it landed with precision, and Alexander did not answer right away. Because the truth was not complicated, it was uncomfortable. He had not looked back, not because he did not care at all, but because caring would have required him to face something he had chosen to leave behind, and facing it would have changed the path he was on. He admitted that quietly, without defense, without justification, and the honesty of it filled the space in a way that excuses never could. Emily nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and when she looked at him again, There was no anger in her eyes, not yet, just clarity, the kind that comes when a question you have carried for years finally has an answer, even if it is not the one you wanted. She took a small step back. Not retreating, just creating space to stand on her own again, and in that moment, the distance between them returned, but it was different now, no longer built on uncertainty, but on truth, and Alexander felt it too, the realization settling in that whatever came next was not about fixing the past, it was about what he chose to do now, because for the first time, the consequences of his choices were not abstract, they were standing in front of him, breathing, waiting. And they were not going to disappear when he walked away. Emily did not move right away, but the weight in the room had shifted into something clearer now, something that no longer hid behind uncertainty, and she let out a slow breath she had been holding for years without realizing it, her fingers still resting lightly against the pendant at her neck as if grounding herself in something that had always been there even when she did not understand it. She looked at Alexander again. Not searching this time, not hoping, just seeing him for what he was. A man who had made a choice long ago and had lived comfortably with it until this moment forced him to look again, and there was something almost steady in that realization, because truth, even when it hurt, was easier to carry than questions that never ended. Her phone vibrated once more, sharper this time, insistent, and she could not ignore it anymore. She reached into her coat and answered quickly, turning slightly away, her voice lowering as she spoke, asking if everything was all right. And the voice on the other end was anxious, telling her that Liam's fever had not gone down, that he had been asking for her, that he sounded weaker, and for the first time since she had walked into the building, something inside Emily broke. Through the control she had been holding, not panic, not fear, but urgency, the kind that stripped everything down to what mattered most. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then said she was on her way, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it, and when she ended the call, the distance between her and Alexander felt different again, smaller in one way, but clearer in another. She turned back to him. And whatever conversation they had been in, whatever truth had just been uncovered, it was no longer the only thing that mattered. She told him simply that she had to go, that her son needed her, and there was no hesitation in that statement, no apology, just priority, and Alexander nodded almost immediately, as if the decision made perfect sense to him, because for the first time, he was seeing the full shape of her life, not just the past that connected them, but the present she was fighting to hold together. He glanced toward the doors, then back at her, asking where she needed to be, and when she told him the address, a modest neighborhood miles from where they stood, something in his expression shifted again, not with judgment, but with awareness, like he was mapping out the distance between his world and hers and realizing how far apart they truly were. He reached into his coat, pulling out his phone, and within seconds, he was giving quiet instructions, efficient, precise. But there was something different in his tone now, something less about control and more about intent. When he finished, he looked at her and said that a car would be waiting outside in less than a minute, that it would take her straight there, no delays. Emily hesitated for a brief second, the instinct to refuse help still present, still familiar. But this was not about pride, not tonight, and she nodded once, accepting without making it into something larger than it needed to be. She turned toward the exit. Her steps quick now, focused, but just before she reached the doors, she stopped, something pulling her back, not physically, but emotionally. She looked over her shoulder, meeting Alexander's gaze one more time, and there was no anger there, no gratitude either, just something honest, something unfinished. And in that quiet exchange, without another word, both of them understood that whatever had started in that lobby was not over, not even close, because the truth had been spoken, but its consequences were only just beginning. And as Emily stepped out into the rain again, this time not alone, not entirely, Alexander remained where he was, the photograph still in his hand. The past no longer distant, the future no longer separate, and for the first time in years he did not turn away from either. The car was already there when Emily stepped outside, its headlights cutting through the rain in a steady glow that felt almost unreal against the chaos of her thoughts, and for a brief moment she hesitated on the sidewalk, the cold water soaking through her shoes, because everything about this night had moved too fast. from questions she had carried her whole life to answers she was not sure how to hold, but Liam's face rose in her mind. The warmth of his small hand, the way he looked at her. Like she could fix anything, and that was enough to push her forward. She opened the door and slid into the back seat, her breath still uneven as she gave the address again, even though it had already been said, as if repeating it would make the distance shorter. The driver nodded and pulled away smoothly, the city lights blurring past as the car moved through streets she knew too well, but tonight they felt different, quieter. Like the world had stepped back to let something else take focus. Emily leaned her head back for a second, closing her eyes, but the moment she did, everything came rushing in, her mother's silence, the unanswered questions, Alexander's voice admitting what he had done and what he had not done, and beneath all of it, something new, something she had not expected, not anger, not yet, but a kind of clarity that made everything sharper, more defined. Like seeing the outline of a story that had always been there but never fully visible. The car slowed as it turned into her neighborhood, the contrast immediate, the polished glass towers replaced by worn buildings and dim streetlights, and Emily opened her eyes again, grounding herself in the reality she knew, because whatever truths she had uncovered, this was still her life, this was still where she belonged, at least for now. The car stopped in front of the building, and she was already moving before it fully came to a halt, pushing the door open and stepping out into the rain again. This time without hesitation, she ran up the short walkway, the familiar creak of the front steps sounding louder than usual. And by the time she reached the door, it was already opening from the inside, Mrs. Thompson standing there with concern etched across her face, stepping aside quickly to let her in. Emily thanked her in a breathless rush as she moved straight down the narrow hallway toward the small bedroom at the end, her heart pounding harder with each step, and when she pushed the door open, everything else fell away. Liam was lying in bed, his cheeks flushed, his breathing shallow but steady, and the moment he saw her, his eyes brightened just enough to reach for her, calling her name softly, and that was it, that was the center of everything. Emily crossed the room in 2 steps and sat beside him, brushing his hair back gently, her hand lingering on his forehead, still warm, still too warm. But he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that trusted her without question, and she returned it, even though her chest felt tight with everything she was carrying. She whispered that she was there, that she was not going anywhere, that everything was going to be okay. Even if she did not yet know how that would be true, and as she sat there, holding his hand, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the world outside seemed to pause again, because in that small room, none of the power, none of the past, none of the unanswered questions mattered more than this. But somewhere across the city, in a building of glass and steel, a man who had spent years moving forward without looking back was standing still for the first time, holding a photograph that no longer felt like history, but like a beginning he had never allowed himself to see. And the distance between those two worlds, once so absolute, had begun to close in a way either of them could ignore. The room felt smaller as the minutes passed, not because the walls moved, but because everything inside it had become more real, more immediate. Emily sat beside Liam with one hand resting lightly against his forehead and the other holding his small fingers, counting each breath without realizing she was doing it. The soft hum of an old floor fan filled the quiet, blending with the faint sound of rain tapping against the window, and for a moment, it almost felt like any other night, except it was not, because everything had changed, even if nothing in this room showed it yet. Liam shifted slightly, his eyes half open as he looked at her, his voice soft but clear enough to reach her, asking if she had gone far, and Emily smiled gently, brushing his hair back again, telling him she had just stepped out for a little while, that she was right there now, and that was all that mattered. He nodded weakly, trusting her completely. And that trust settled deep in her chest, heavier than anything Alexander had said, heavier than any truth she had uncovered, because this was the part of her life she had built on her own, without answers, without help, without anyone choosing to stay. And now, sitting here, she realized that no truth could take that away, not even the one she had just faced. Mrs. Thompson appeared quietly in the doorway, her voice low as she asked if Emily needed anything, if she should call a doctor, if there was someone else who could help, and Emily shook her head softly, thanking her, saying she would stay for now, that she would keep watching him, that she would decide the next step once she knew more. Mrs. Thompson nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile before stepping away, leaving the door slightly open, as if to remind Emily that she was not completely alone. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair, exhaustion catching up to her in waves, but her mind would not rest. It kept returning to the lobby, to Alexander's voice, to the way he had said her mother's name like it had never really left him, and she tried to understand what that meant, not just for him, but for her, because knowing the truth did not suddenly give her direction, it did not tell her what to do next. It only made everything clearer, sharper, and in some ways harder. Liam's hand tightened slightly around hers, pulling her back to the present, and she focused on that, on the warmth of his skin, on the steady rise and fall of his chest, grounding herself in something that did not depend on the past, something that was still hers to protect, but across the city, in a quiet office high above empty streets. Alexander stood alone, the photograph laid out on his desk now, the pendant he remembered reflected faintly in his mind, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to think through every moment he had pushed aside, every decision he had justified, not with the confidence that had built his empire, but with a question he could no longer ignore: what had it cost, not in business, not in success, but in something far more permanent. And as he reached for his phone again, not to give instructions, not to manage a problem, but to act on something personal, something unresolved, he understood that whatever distance had existed between his life and Emily's was no longer something he could maintain, because the truth had not only been revealed, it had created a connection that demanded more than acknowledgement, it demanded a choice, and this time, walking away was no longer an option he could pretend not to see. The night stretched longer than it should have, each minute folding quietly into the next as Emily remained by Liam's side, her posture still, her senses alert to every small change, the faint crease in his brow, the subtle shift in his breathing, the way his fingers occasionally tightened around hers as if holding on to something unseen. The digital clock on the wall blinked past midnight, then past 1, but time no longer felt linear. It felt suspended, like everything outside this room had slowed down to match the rhythm of his breath. She reached for a damp cloth resting in a small bowl beside the bed and gently pressed it to his forehead, the coolness drawing a soft sigh from him. And that small response gave her something to hold on to, something immediate, something she could do, because action, even small, was the only thing that kept fear from growing too loud. Her eyes moved briefly to the doorway, half expecting Mrs. Thompson to appear again, but the hallway remained quiet, dimly lit, a reminder that the world was still there, just not inside this moment. Emily leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the edge of the mattress, her head lowering for just a second as exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind refused to fully rest. It kept circling back, not to the questions anymore, but to the answers, to the way Alexander had spoken, not as a distant figure, not as someone removed from consequence, but as someone who had finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done, and that difference mattered more than she expected, because it meant something had shifted, not just in her life, but in his. And that kind of shift did not happen without reason. Liam stirred again, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked if she would still be there when he woke up, and Emily's heart tightened at the simplicity of the question. She brushed her thumb gently across his hand and told him yes, always. The word came out instinctively, without hesitation, because in this space, in this role, there was no room for uncertainty, only presence, only staying. His eyes closed again slowly, comforted by that answer, and Emily watched him for a long moment, making sure his breathing remained steady, that his expression softened back into sleep, and only then did she allow herself to lean back slightly in the chair, her body still tense but her focus widening just enough to notice the quiet hum of the apartment again, the distant sound of a car passing outside, the faint creak of the building settling, ordinary sounds that grounded her in something real, something familiar. But somewhere else in the city, Alexander had not returned to the stillness he once preferred. His office lights remained on, the photograph now joined by a second object on his desk, an old file he had requested within minutes of Emily leaving, documents he had not opened in years, records that once represented decisions made quickly, efficiently, without pause. but tonight, he moved through them slowly, deliberately, reading each line as if it carried weight it had not held before, and the more he read, the clearer the pattern became, not just of what he had done, but of what he had chosen not to do, the absence of action standing out louder than any decision he had made. He leaned back in his chair for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting that realization settle in fully, because understanding was no longer enough. Acknowledgement alone did not change anything, and for the first time, he found himself considering something unfamiliar, not how to solve a problem, not how to manage an outcome, but how to show up, how to be present in a way he had once dismissed as unnecessary. He reached for his phone again, not with hesitation, but with intention, and as he dialed, the distance between his world and Emily's no longer felt like a gap he could observe from afar, it felt like something he was already crossing. Step by step, choice by choice, without the certainty he was used to. But with something else, something quieter, something that did not come from control, but from responsibility. And as the call connected, he understood that whatever came next would not be defined by the past alone, but by whether he was finally willing to stay when it mattered most. A soft gray light had begun to creep through the thin curtains by the time Emily realized she had not slept at all. The night had passed in fragments, measured not in hours but in breaths, in small movements, in the quiet reassurance of Liam's hand still resting in hers, and for the first time since she had walked into that glass building, the world felt slower again, not calmer, but clearer. She shifted slightly in the chair, her back stiff from holding the same position for so long, but she did not let go of him, not even for a second, because somewhere between midnight and morning, something inside her had settled into a quiet understanding, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but awareness, the kind that does not disappear once it arrives. Liam stirred again, his breathing deeper now, less strained, and when she placed her hand gently against his forehead, the warmth had eased just enough to loosen the tightness in her chest. She let out a slow breath, almost a whisper, and for a moment she allowed herself to close her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest inside that small improvement, because sometimes hope did not come in big moments, sometimes it came in degrees, in inches, in the difference between fear and relief. A faint knock at the door pulled her attention, and Mrs. Thompson stepped in quietly, carrying a mug in both hands, offering it with a soft smile, the kind that did not ask questions, just provided comfort. Emily accepted it with a quiet thank you, the warmth of the cup grounding her in the present, reminding her that she was not completely alone in this space, that even in the middle of uncertainty, there were still small acts of kindness that asked for nothing in return. She took a careful sip, the heat spreading slowly through her, and for a second, everything felt still, balanced between what had happened and what was yet to come. But then her phone lit up on the small table beside the bed, the screen glowing in the dim light, and she froze, not because she did not expect it, but because she did, because some part of her had been waiting for it since she left that lobby. The name on the screen was simple, unfamiliar in format but unmistakable in meaning, and her fingers hovered above it for a brief second, caught between instinct and choice. Because answering it meant continuing something she had not yet decided she was ready to face. Liam shifted slightly again, his grip tightening for just a moment before relaxing, and that small movement grounded her once more, reminding her that whatever conversation waited on the other end of that call, it would have to exist alongside this, not instead of it. She picked up the phone slowly and stepped just outside the doorway, keeping it open enough to hear him if he stirred, her voice low as she answered, and on the other end. Alexander did not speak immediately, the silence carrying the weight of everything that had not been said yet, but when he did, his voice was different, not controlled in the way she had first heard it, not distant, but measured, intentional, as if every word had been chosen carefully before being spoken. He asked how Liam was, not as a formality, not as a polite opening, but as something that genuinely mattered, and Emily answered honestly, telling him that the fever had come down a little, that she was still watching him, that she was staying, and there was a pause on the line, not empty, but full, like both of them were adjusting to the reality of this conversation. Because it was no longer about the past alone, it was about what came next, and for the first time, Emily realized that the truth she had uncovered was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a decision, one that neither of them could make alone, but one that would shape everything moving forward, whether they were ready for it or not. Emily did not speak right away, not because she did not have words, but because she was choosing them carefully for the first time, her gaze drifting back into the room where Liam rested, the soft rise and fall of his chest anchoring her in something real, something steady, and when she finally responded, her voice was calm, grounded, telling Alexander that knowing the truth did not change what her life had been. That it did not erase the years her mother had struggled or the nights she had spent wondering why things never quite added up. There was no accusation in her tone, just clarity, the kind that did not need to be loud to be heard. On the other end of the line, Alexander listened without interruption, and for once, he did not try to respond immediately. He let the weight of her words settle fully, because he understood now that this was not a conversation to manage, it was one to experience. He said quietly that he knew that there was nothing he could say that would undo what had already been lived, but that did not mean he would step back again, not this time. Emily leaned slightly against the doorframe, her fingers tightening around the phone as she absorbed that, not as a promise, but as a statement of intent, an intent, she knew, was only meaningful if it was followed by action. She asked him what that meant, not challenging, not defensive, just direct. And there was a pause before he answered, a pause that felt different from the ones before, not uncertain, but deliberate. He said that it meant he was not going to treat this as something that could be resolved with distance or time, that he was not going to offer solutions that removed him from the situation, that whatever responsibility existed here, he was willing to face it fully. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, letting that settle. Because it was not what she had expected, not entirely. She had prepared herself for denial, for explanation, even for apology, but not for presence, not for someone choosing to stay when it was no longer convenient. She opened her eyes again and looked toward Liam, still sleeping, still peaceful in a way that felt fragile, and she realized that whatever she decided next would not be about her alone. It would affect him too, the life she had built, the stability she had fought to create, even in its imperfections. She told Alexander that she was not looking for anything from him, not money, not support, not even an apology, because none of those things could rewrite the past, and he did not argue with that. He simply acknowledged it, saying that he understood, that this was not about what she asked for, it was about what he chose to do regardless, and that distinction lingered between them, quiet but significant. Emily shifted slightly, stepping back into the room, keeping the phone close as she moved to sit beside Liam again, her free hand returning to his, grounding herself once more in the role she knew best. She said that if he wanted to be part of this in any way, it would not be on his terms alone, it would not be controlled or scheduled or managed, it would be real, unpredictable, and sometimes inconvenient, and she let that hang there, not as a warning, but as a truth he needed to understand. Alexander did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, steady, saying that he was not looking for control, that he had spent enough of his life building things that worked perfectly on paper but failed in ways that mattered, and that he was ready to accept something that did not fit into a system, something that required him to show up without knowing exactly how it would unfold. Emily listened, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was a small shift in her expression, not quite trust, but something close to it, something that allowed the possibility of change to exist without fully accepting it yet. She looked down at Liam again, brushing his hair back gently, and then she spoke softly, telling Alexander that this was not going to be easy, that it would take time, that it would take consistency, not just words. And there was a quiet understanding in his response, a simple acknowledgement that did not try to promise more than he could guarantee, because this time, he was not trying to convince her, he was choosing to begin. And as the call continued in that quiet, measured space, both of them understood that the truth had already been spoken, but what mattered now was what they built from it, step by step, moment by moment, without certainty, but with something far more important, the willingness to stay. The conversation did not end with a clear resolution, it settled into something quieter, something unfinished but no longer uncertain, and after a few more words that carried more weight than length, Emily ended the call, not abruptly, not reluctantly, just with a quiet understanding that what needed to be said for now had been said. She placed the phone down beside her and let her hand rest there for a moment, as if feeling the absence of the voice that had just filled the space. Then she turned her attention fully back to Liam, because no matter what had shifted outside this room, this was still where her life existed. He stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to find her, and when he saw that she was still there, something in his expression softened, the kind of quiet relief that did not need words. Emily smiled gently, leaning closer as she asked how he was feeling, and he whispered that he felt a little better, that his head did not hurt as much, and that small change felt larger than anything else that had happened that night. She adjusted the blanket around him, tucking it carefully as if that simple act could hold everything in place. The morning light grew a little stronger through the window, soft and steady, revealing the small details of the room more clearly, the worn edges of the dresser, the stack of folded clothes in the corner, the life she had built piece by piece without anyone stepping in to make it easier, and for a moment, she let herself see it fully, not as something lacking, but as something she had created, something that had held her and her son through every unanswered question. And that realization did not disappear just because she now knew the truth. If anything, it made it stronger, because it meant that everything she had endured had not been built on illusion, it had been built on her choices, her resilience, her willingness to stay even when it would have been easier to give up. Liam reached for her hand again, his fingers curling around hers with a little more strength now, and she held on to that, grounding herself in the present, but somewhere else. Alexander had not returned to routine. The files on his desk remained open, the photographs still visible among them, but his focus had shifted beyond reflection into something more active. He had already set things in motion, not grand gestures, not declarations, but practical steps that required him to enter a world he had never needed to understand before. He had asked questions he had never considered asking, about schools, about medical care, about the kind of support that did not come with conditions or control, and each answer had revealed a gap between what he knew and what he needed to learn. And instead of stepping back from that discomfort, he leaned into it, because for the first time, the outcome was not measured in success or failure, it was measured in presence, in whether he could show up consistently in a life that did not revolve around him. And that difference changed everything. Back in the apartment, Emily stood slowly, stretching slightly before moving to the small kitchen, preparing something simple, a glass of water, a piece of toast. Small things that anchored the day in normalcy. Even as nothing felt entirely normal anymore, she glanced at her phone once more, not expecting anything immediate, but aware that the connection established the night before was still there, not resolved, not defined, but present, and she understood now that whatever came next would not be decided in a single moment. It would unfold over time, through choices, through actions, through whether words turned into something real. And as she returned to Liam's side, placing the glass within reach and sitting beside him once more, she realized that the truth had not broken her life apart. It had revealed the foundation beneath it, and now, for the first time, she had the chance to decide what to build on top of it, not alone, but not dependent either, just aware, just present, and ready to see what came next. The morning did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, in quiet layers of light and sound, and by the time the sun had fully risen above the buildings outside, the small apartment felt warmer, steadier, as if the night had carried something heavy away with it. Emily sat beside Liam with a calm she had not felt in a long time, not because everything was solved, not because the future was clear, but because something inside her had shifted into place, something that no longer needed to question what had already been lived. Liam pushed himself up slightly against the pillows, his strength returning little by little, and when he looked at her, there was more color in his face, more life in his eyes, and that alone was enough to steady everything else. She handed him the glass of water, watching carefully as he took a small sip, and he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried trust without needing explanation. And she returned it without hesitation, because this, right here, was still the center of everything, not the past, not the truths she had uncovered, but the life she continued to build, moment by moment, choice by choice. A soft knock at the door interrupted the quiet, and Emily looked up, her body instinctively alert for a brief second before she moved to answer it. When she opened the door, she paused, not in shock, not in confusion, but in recognition of something she had already felt coming. Alexander stood there, not in the distant way he had been. In the lobby, not separated by glass or expectation, but present, real, his posture steady, his expression composed but different, less guarded, less removed, as if the distance he had carried for years had been left somewhere behind him. He did not step inside immediately, he did not assume, he simply met her gaze and waited, and that alone said more than anything he could have explained. Emily held the door for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision in front of her. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real, because letting him in was not about forgiveness, it was not about forgetting, it was about allowing something new to exist alongside everything that had already happened. She stepped aside quietly, not as an invitation filled with emotion, but as a choice made with clarity, and Alexander entered slowly, his eyes taking in the small space, the worn furniture, the life that had continued without him, and for a moment, he did not speak. Because there was nothing to say that would not feel insufficient. Instead, he looked toward Liam's room, where the soft light still filtered in, and Emily followed his gaze, understanding without words what mattered most. They moved together down the hallway, not as people who had resolved everything, but as two individuals stepping into the same space for the first time with full awareness of what it meant. When they reached the doorway, Liam looked up, curious, his eyes moving from his mother to the man beside her. And Emily rested her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding herself in the moment before it fully unfolded. Alexander did not step forward right away, he did not speak first, he simply stood there, present, allowing the moment to exist without rushing it. Because this was not something that could be managed or controlled, it had to be lived, and in that quiet space, something new began to take shape, not perfect, not certain, but real. Because sometimes the truth does not come to end a story, sometimes it comes to remind you that it is not over yet, and that what matters most is not what was broken, but who chooses to stay and build something honest from it.